want to go broad for a second and talk about the concept of intelligent design. For those who really aren't familiar with it, I guess when you talk about the materialist hypothesis that there is nothing in the universe except material, right? And people say unless you can touch it or smell it or whatever, in other words, unless science can put it in a test tube and it doesn't exist, right?
Right.
And it's always struck me that most people don't operate with that hypothesis. Most people know there's something else, even if you don't know what the something else is, right? Even just the mystery of gravity would lead you to think, as it did Newton, there's something else, something we haven't discovered yet. But then the big question is there something else beyond the known universe? And we don't just mean at the end of the universe, is there something beyond it, but is there something beyond the material?
Well, before we even get to that big question of beyond the universe, I think it's perfectly appropriate to think of what there is beyond just the matter and energy around us. And
right.
there's another fundamental entity that we're all aware of, and that's mind, because we have them. We are self-consciously aware.
Speak for yourself, Stephen Meyer. It's now, when you say we all have minds, right? We know that a materialist would say, no. We have brains, and a brain is like a computer. You're talking about some spiritual thing called mind. I don't believe in that, and I believe you're confusing mind with brain, and you're somehow spiritualizing it. So isn't it true that a materialist, a scientistic thinker, I don't mean scientific, but scientistic, somebody who says there's nothing outside the realm of science, that's it, would argue there is no mind, even though most people kind of feel that there is.
You have a lovely, vividly blue tie on right now. And I have
Do I?
I'm complimenting your tie, but I'm also perceiving it, right?
Yeah.
So I have a self-conscious awareness of that bright blue color, and there's nothing that corresponds to the electrochemistry in my brain. The electrochemistry in my brain we think helps generate that image, but I have a first-person self-conscious awareness of that blue that is separate from what my brain cells are doing. And most of us have an awareness of our own consciousness and our own rational abilities as conscious minds. So we have a first-person, direct, introspective awareness of the reality of a mind. And so
now say the same thing in English.
I just mean...
No, I know.
Yeah.
Actually, let me say what you just said. Most of these people know what you just said, but just to be clear, because this is such an important point, and I want to kind of pivot on this point. What you're saying is that a computer or a brain by itself is not conscious. Consciousness, your ability to perceive yourself and to perceive other people, whatever that mystery is.
To think, to deliberate, to hope, to fear, to all those things, yes.
Cannot be accounted for through circuits or just a brain or whatever. You're saying there's this other thing. And I think most people would agree with you that there's this thing, whether it's consciousness or mind, there's something beyond just some pink tissue in our skulls. And so then my question is, why do people in the scientific world today have this hard line? Why do they get upset at the implication that there's something beyond what science can tell us? Why is there this, even the idea that there's some kind of a problem between faith and science? Where do we think that came from? Because that's the question that we're really talking about.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to answer that. One is historically to look back in the late 19th century. There's a whole series of theories about origins that suggest that undirected natural processes could account for anything, including, for example, the origin of life and the origin of new forms of life.
Okay, Darwin. So the first issue here is Darwin.
You get a scientific materialist synthesis at the end of the 19th century, and then they codify the idea that if you're going to be a scientist, you must explain things in terms of undirected material processes. That's one way of answering your question.
It just sort of, what you're saying is it just sort of happened.
Well, there's an historical shift in thinking in the period of Newton and Kepler and Boyle.
Right.
They made design arguments in their scientific work. This was part of science.
Many of them obviously were devout Christians.
They were, but they also thought they were seeing evidence of design in their scientific studies.
Okay, so historically there was not a problem or a perceived problem between so-called faith or Christian faith and so-called science. But something happened.
One supported the other, and there was a kind of close connection between the two. Where,
so on the contrary, they supported each other.
So this was a shift in the late 19th century. A canon of method was established or promulgated by Darwin and others that said if you're going to be a scientist, you must limit yourself to explain things by reference to material processes only. But there are so many things that we just look around us. We think of the information on a road sign or the computer code or many, many things around us we know are the product of intelligence, of mind.
Right.
And this is the other way of answering your question. What happened? Why do people object? Many scientists working at the bench they forget about the role their own mind is playing in the experiments that they're executing.
Yeah.
So Professor Tour, for example, has shown that many of these guys doing these what are called prebiotic simulation experiments are actively involved in choosing purified chemicals. They have a chemical recipe that they use to get the molecules to combine and recombine in different ways so that the molecules are more life relevant. But at every step of the way, this process is guided by their own scientific intelligence, and they just kind of forget that the mind is playing a crucial role.
In other words, they're cheating.
Well, it is a cheat if you want to turn around.
But I mean, of course, that's of course what it is. Now, James Tour is right here. Is he misrepresenting you, or are we okay? He's okay? All right. If he misrepresents
he's much better
you,
on this, and you'll hear him tomorrow. Yeah.
All right. Is Marshall McLuhan in the audience? I guess everybody who cares about life, the meaning of life, we think about these things, and we think about how do we know what we know, and so on and so forth. So what you've just said, most of us here grew up in a world where the Miller experiment that said that life was created out of the primordial soup with no touch from God or anything like that. We all were taught this in schools, and it was accepted. And when in the 1980s there were questions about this, nobody contacted us by mail or phone and said, by the way, you know that thing that was on the test? We no longer really know if that's true. We just wanted you to be clear on that. It's like product, a recall on a car. They would have to legally contact you and say, by the way, we told you it was the greatest car in the world. It could kill you. So that never happened. And that to me is interesting because that's how as a culture we process stuff, right? Like stuff gets out there. I was always taught that Darwin was right and the idea of natural selection, and this is how it all happened. No one ever contacted me to say, by the way, there are a lot of big questions that have come up. And even evolutionists like Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard is asking questions. But that information never gets out.
There's been no recall on those bad textbooks. That's absolutely true. But nobody in origin of life research today thinks that the Miller-Urey experiment solves the problem. At best, it would give you amino acids, which are a building block for proteins. But to get an actual protein that folds up and does an actual job, you've got to sequence those amino acids properly. That requires a big information input, and that's the unanswered question. Where does that information come from?
And they don't know. And I remember reading an article in the Atlantic Monthly in the 80s on this question of the origin of life. And I don't know, but I remember reading it, and it was a long article. But what it said at the end effectively was, we thought we knew how life evolved, but the more we know, the more we discover that, in fact, we have no idea, right? And it feels like that's what you're talking about with the return of the God hypothesis. In other words, that the more we know scientifically, the more we realize that the concept of a creator, of a mind, it's more and more plausible the more science progresses, which is the opposite of the thesis that the more we know in science, the less there's a need for God.
Yeah, this is the opposite of a God of the gaps argument.
Right.
In the case I made for intelligent design just in biology, I actually self-consciously applied the method of reasoning that I learned from Darwin. And he had this rule of reasoning, which was, if you want to explain an event in the remote past, you should look around and observe cause and effect processes and invoke a vera causa, a true cause, a cause which is known to produce the effect in question. And I got to thinking, well, what is the effect, what is the cause that we know that produces digital information? And we know of only one. It's a mind. It's a programmer. Bill Gates, our local hero in Seattle, says DNA is like a computer program, only much more advanced than any we've ever devised. And in fact, we know from our experience, our uniform and repeated experience, that whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, whether it's in a hieroglyphic inscription, a paragraph in a book,
right,
information embedded in a radio signal, or the information that's generated in a prebiotic simulation experiment or a computer program that's supposedly simulating evolution, there's always an intelligent input that accounts for that information. So I said, maybe we should learn something from nature and apply that to the problem of the origin of information, which is at the foundation of life, and infer that there was a designing intelligence behind that information too.
Okay, but the person disagreeing with you would say, given infinite time, anything can happen. In other words, if I flip a coin and it lands on its side, people go, ooh. But they know it can happen sometimes. It'll happen. If I flip a coin 10,000 times, once or twice or whatever, it'll happen. But if I flip it again and it lands on its side a second time, you'd be a little weirded out. What's the trick? If I did it a third time and I sat here for 20 minutes and every time I flipped a dime, it landed on its side, everyone would say, something's going on. This doesn't make sense. But somebody might say, look, mathematically, given an infinite number of time, it is possible that that would happen in infinity. So what really changed all of this, it seems to me, is the Big Bang Theory that said we no longer have infinite time. We only have whatever it is, 12 or 15 billion years. So at what point did the Big Bang Theory grab a hold, generally speaking, and began to freak out the scientists who'd pinned everything on infinite time?
That's a great question. Quick little sidelight is that that's absolutely right. That established what is called a limit on the probabilistic resources, the number of tries you would have to win the biological cosmic lottery, if you will. There's another aspect of that, and Dr. Turer will probably talk about this tomorrow in his talk, and that is that chemically speaking, time is actually not your friend. That if you're lucky enough to get some molecules to arrange themselves into something that's moving in the right direction of life, all the other processes at work are going to swamp that and unwind that before you get any further. And he'll explain more about how the chemistry of that works. But the chance-based argument is suspect for two reasons. One, time isn't your friend. It works against the chemical synthesis of life. But also, there's a limit to the amount of time, and that's absolutely right. In both of my books, I look carefully at the mathematics of this. And I have an illustration I like to use of a bike lock. You've got a 4-dial lock, right, and I often ask the audience, well, if you have a thief, is it more likely that he'll crack the code or not? And they'll say, oh, well, 4-dial lock, it's unlikely. Well, unless the thief has enough time to sample more than half of the combinations. So you always have to assess if you're assessing the plausibility of a random search for an informational sequence, right, you have to know how many opportunities you have, right, versus the complexity of the sequence. It turns out when you do the math, both in the prebiotic case and in the biological case, that is, even assuming you've got life to start with and now the Darwinian mechanism of mutation and selection takes over, in both cases, you don't have the probabilistic resources necessary to build even standard length functional proteins. That there's so many possible combinations that have to be searched that there's not enough time in a random search to succeed.
So the larger idea, and I know some folks are tracking and maybe some aren't, but the idea is that many of us have heard this idea. I don't know who said it, but somebody once said that, if you have, you probably know it more exactly than I do, but monkeys typing on typewriters, right? Randomly, hitting random stuff. Eventually, given enough time, randomly they would produce the works of William Shakespeare. Because it just has to happen randomly, right? That if a monkey just goes like this, at some point, maybe it takes years, but words will randomly come together. So what we're really dealing with here is the idea that you're saying, I want to make sure that I'm clear on this, that you're saying that what is in DNA is so complex, it's like a library of books. So it's not like a monkey that would just, random, and it's like, oh, he just typed the word the. Oh, he just typed the word cat. We're talking about 50 novels by Dickens and Tolstoy. We're talking about something so complex that you're saying that science now knows that there could never have been enough time.
It's the calculations that I show that it's more likely that a random search for a new gene sequence capable of building a new functional protein it's overwhelmingly more likely that such a search would fail than it would succeed, given all the possible opportunities there are for such a search to occur since the first life till now. So it's still, remember Jim Carrey in that film? He asks the girl to go out, and he says, what are the chances that a girl like me and a guy like you could get together? And he misses his pickup line, and she says, not good. And he says, what do you mean? Like 1 in 100? And she says, no, 1 in a million, buddy. And then he starts jumping up and down and says, oh, so there's a chance. There's a chance. Right. Okay, there's always a chance.
Right.
But the question is it more likely that a random search would succeed or fail? And we can show conclusively that it's more likely that it will fail. And therefore, the idea that natural selection plus random mutation is the means by which new information was generated is also more likely to be false than true. And in science, we prefer not to have more likely to be false hypotheses, and we prefer more likely to be true hypotheses.
The most fascinating part of what you just said to me is that somebody could be as smart as you and still watch Jim Carrey movies. Isn't that the big takeaway? That's the surprise. It's incredible.